All right, so in this video, we are going to start talking about the brain. Okay, so as with most things we discuss, we're going to start with kind of an overview of the major 4 regions of the brain. And then we'll talk about the coverings on the brain and kind of move inward from there. Okay, so we'll kind of start from our outside of our brain and work our way in. Okay, so for our overview, the brain can be divided into 4 kind of major subdivisions, right, or regions. Okay, so the first one is the cerebrum. Okay, and so the cerebrum is the outside, all right, of the brain. When you look at the brain and it's all kind of wrinkly on the outside, right, all of that kind of on the top outer part of the brain is the cerebrum. Okay, and so the cerebrum is involved in many important processes that we'll talk about. It processes a lot of higher order thinking, all right, and consciousness, all right. It also is involved in your sensory perception, whether it's touch or smell or sight or taste, right? Even some speech areas are involved in the cerebrum. And it initiates voluntary motor movement. Okay, so all of that stuff is happening in the cerebrum. All right, and we're going to talk about all of this in detail. And then just kind of posterior and below the cerebrum, right, we have the cerebellum. Okay, and so the cerebellum is important for balance and equilibrium. All right, which I think everybody is maybe a little familiar with, right? That's important for the cerebellum. It's also involved in kind of learning certain motor skills, right? Repeated motor skills like riding a bike or something like that involves the cerebellum as well, okay? And it helps to coordinate muscle movement, all right? And then we have the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is an internal region of the brain. So we have the big cerebrum on the outside. In the middle of that cerebrum, right, deep inside of that cerebrum is the diencephalon. And so the diencephalon has many, many functions because it's divided into a bunch of different regions, right? Those regions are divided into more regions, and they all have their own functions. Even a lot of that is still being researched and studied. All right, so it's very complex. So a few things that the diencephalon does, all right, is that it's involved in hormonal control. Okay, part of the diencephalon controls one of your major endocrine structures, which is the pituitary gland. So part of the diencephalon is going to control that pituitary gland, all right? The diencephalon is also involved in smooth muscle control. So this would be involuntary muscle, all right? Smooth muscle control. And temperature regulation, as well as many vital functions are here, right? So we'll talk about those. Okay, so the diencephalon, all right, and then we have the brainstem. So the brainstem is posterior to the cerebrum and to the diencephalon, right? And it extends, below it extends the spinal cord, all right? So it's kind of between the cerebrum and the spinal cord is the brainstem. Okay, the brainstem also has different regions, right? But many of them are involved in vital functions. All right, so these are things like breathing, right? Heart rate, dilation and constriction of your blood vessel, so blood pressure, that sort of thing, all right, are going to be in the brain stem. Okay, so those are our major 4 kind of regions within the brain. So we'll talk about each of those and structures within them and some specific functions. But let's talk about the coverings on the brain first. Okay, so the coverings on the brain are called the meninges. Okay, so this is a connective tissue covering around the brain. And it's divided into 3 major layers. So we're going to start from the outside and work our way in. Okay, so on this picture, what we're looking at, we see is we have our epidermis, right? We would have our dermis and hypodermis here. Then we have the bone of the skull, all right? And so now we reach our first layer of meninges here, okay? So that would be our dura mater, okay? So we have our dura mater, kind of point all the way around here, okay? So we have our dura mater there. That is the outermost layer, right? So it is connected to the skull, right? So that dura mater is divided into 2 separate layers itself. So we have the periosteal layer, all right? So osteal, right? Meaning it's next to the bone. So it's going to be the layer that's attached to the skull, right? That would be this layer here that's touching the skull. And then you have the meningeal layer, which is just deep to that, all right? So the meningeal layer, we can see here in kind of this tan color, all right? And it extends down between the hemispheres of the brain, all right? So we have, what we're looking at here is like our left and our right kind of sides or hemispheres of the brain. And so that meningeal layer extends down in between those hemispheres into this structure called the longitudinal, and I'll label it here, all right? Longitudinal fissure. And so fissure being kind of a, like a large indentation or groove, all right? This would be that longitudinal fissure, okay? And so we have our meningeal layer here, all right, deep to the periosteal layer of the dura mater, and it extends down into that longitudinal fissure. This part that extends into that fissure is called the falx cerebri, okay? The falx cerebri is what's going to extend down into that longitudinal fissure. So that's the falx cerebri, okay? Good, okay. So, and then one last thing to point out while we're here, all right, is that between this meningeal layer, all right, here, and our periosteal layer runs this blue structure that they've shown here. This is actually a very large vein that runs down that fissure, right, that longitudinal fissure. So it runs kind of down the middle of your brain, okay? And so we're going to talk about this in more detail, but it is called, we'll go ahead and label it, it's called the superior sagittal sinus, right? So sinus, in this case, referring to a type of vein, right? Not like a hole in a skull bone, right? So certain types of veins are called sinuses as well. Okay, so superior sagittal sinus runs between the right and left hemisphere of the brain. Okay. All right, good. Through that longitudinal fissure. Great. Okay, so now let's move on to our next layer. So that was the dura mater. The dura mater had 2 parts, the periosteal layer here attached to the skull, and deep to that we have the meningeal layer here, which extends into that longitudinal fissure. That part is called the falx cerebri. And then we have the superior sagittal sinus running between those 2 layers of dura mater. All right, and just inside of that meningeal layer, we have this structure here, right? That's our next layer called the arachnoid mater. Okay, so we have the arachnoid mater. I'll kind of, label it here. All right, so that's the arachnoid mater, called arachnoid mater because it has all of these collagen and elastic fibers, right, that kind of extend from it down towards the brain, and it ends up looking kind of spider web like, right? So arachnoid referring to spiders, all right? And so that's kind of a spider web appearance, okay? All Right, so we have a subdural space that's going to be between the duramater and the arachnoid. All right, so we have our subdural space. We just, label it. Come on. Here, right? It's just this little space before that arachnoid mater. All right. So between the duramater and the arachnoid mater, we have the subdural space. And then we also can have bleeds that form in that space. All right. So if you have some sort of injury to your head that causes bleeding, right, one thing is that it could bleed into that space. That is called a subdural hematoma. All right. So this is bleeding in the subdural space. Okay. All right, so that's a subdural hematoma. You could also have an epidural hematoma. So that would be a hematoma that occurs between the dura and the skull, right? So that would be up here. All right, so between that periosteal layer and the skull would be an epidural hematoma. So both of these types of hematomas can be deadly, right? But they do differ because of kind of the structure of the meninges. Okay, and so with a subdural hematoma, all right, you have that bleeding into this space. So that bleed, right, that hematoma can fill that space rather quickly, right? It has more room to spread out. And so subdural hematomas typically occur more rapidly, right? And they are much more deadly in, a quicker fashion, okay? So they'd be more deadly more quickly because that blood gets into the space and it can just spread. And the reason it's so dangerous is because you have, right, this fluid filling all this space, and it's certainly not going to be pushing out on the bone, right? That bone is not going anywhere. So instead, it starts pushing pressure on the brain itself, okay? And that can cause brain damage and lead to death, okay? And so with a subdural hematoma, that blood can fill the space very quickly and start very quickly putting pressure on the brain. Versus with an epidural hematoma, this is a much tighter space, right? That periosteal layer of the dura is pretty tightly connected to the bone. So it's not as easy for blood to spread, right, in that little space there. So it's a much slower bleed. It can still be deadly if it goes undetected, right? But it occurs more slowly. So you have more time to detect it, all right? Okay. And so those are kind of how those two types of hematomas are different. All right, so now let's move on and talk about our arachnoid mater. Okay, and so the arachnoid mater, again, is deep to the duramater. It looks kind of spiderweb-like because of all those collagen and elastic fibers. And below it, where we see all those kind of spider webs, we have this arachnoid space. All right, so this would be the arachnoid space. That arachnoid space is filled with fluid. All right, that fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. All right, and we're going to talk about CSF in detail and how it's made in just a little bit. Okay, so in this space, we have CSF, right, flowing around, moving around, okay? And then we also have, with the arachnoid mater, these kind of protrusions of that arachnoid mater into that superior sagittal sinus. These are called arachnoid villi. All right, so these are protrusions of the arachnoid mater into the superior sagittal sinus. And the function of these villi is to help drain that CSF. Okay, so that CSF travels all around the brain, around the spinal cord, and it's eventually returned to the blood here by these arachnoid villi. All right, And then our very last layer of dura, right, or meninges, is the pia mater. And so I'll label that up here so I don't have to do a big long arrow, right? So the pia mater is the layer of the meninges that sits directly on top of the brain. Okay, and so it essentially almost like shrink wraps the brain. Okay, so it sits on top of the brain and it kind of folds down into the kind of indentations on the brain. We know the brain looks really wrinkly, right? Those wrinkles are all filled with pia mater. So it sits directly on the surface of the brain. All right, so that's outside of the brain. So now let's look inside and talk about, there are spaces in the brain, right? And these are spaces that are going to contain that CSF we just mentioned, okay? So these are called ventricles. So ventricles are spaces inside of the brain, okay? And so what they're showing here from this picture, which is in your textbook, right, is the kind of spaces when they're filled with like a blue color, okay? So all of these spaces would be filled with fluid. All right, so when we look from the side, we have these large kind of comma-shaped spaces. All right, looking from the front, those commas are kind of, there's one on the left and one on the right, okay? And then running kind of down the middle of the brain, we have this, it kind of looks like a little chicken, right? That's another ventricle we'll talk about. And then from that, the kind of neck of the chicken extends down the brainstem into the spinal cord, okay? And so that's what we see here too. Okay, so these regions are filled with fluid, all right? Specifically, they're filled with CSF. That CSF is going to be circulating. These are also regions where that CSF is made. Okay, we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about cerebrospinal fluid, what it is, and how it's made. Okay. And then we will look at the different ventricles of the brain, right? We'll probably actually go back up to that picture and label what those ventricles are called. Okay, so CSF, it is made by what is called the choroid plexus. Okay, so the choroid plexus, its function is to make CSF, all right? It's composed of a series of capillaries that are surrounded by ependymal cells. Remember our cells that help to circulate that CSF. So we have our little ependymal cells here, and we have our little capillaries kind of running inside of them, okay? And that is helping to make the CSF, right? And so that CSF is made from the plasma of the blood. So when we talk about the composition of CSF, it essentially is blood plasma, but without the kind of large proteins that are found in blood plasma, okay? Because they would be too large to get through the capillary wall and past those ependymal cells, okay? But it's going to contain a lot of ions, nutrients, right? Some waste products, which can then be, put back into the blood at that superior sagittal sinus and filtered out, as a waste product, all right? So let's talk about where it's made. And in doing this, we can look at the names of our different ventricles, okay? So CSF is made, all right, in 3 different regions of the brain. Okay, so it's made in the lateral ventricles, all right? So let's label, I think this picture is a little easier to see them on. Let's label our lateral ventricles. We have 2 of them, all right? So lateral ventricles. These are those big kind of comma-shaped ventricles. So looking at them from the front, right, we have one lateral ventricle here and here, all right? And then this is them kind of from the side. Okay, so we have our 2 lateral ventricles. We have CSF that is made in them, so they contain choroid plexus, all right? And so that would be what we are seeing kind of right here, all right? So this would be choroid plexus in our lateral ventricle, making our CSF, all right? And it's going to flow from there, all right? It'll flow into this next ventricle, right? The chicken kind of looking ventricle, which is called the third ventricle. All right, because that's technically 1 and 2 are lateral ventricles. And then we have our third ventricle, which looks like a chicken. All right, in that third ventricle, we also have CSF being made. So you can see that choroid here, all right, and that third ventricle also making CSF. Okay, and then that CSF is going to travel down through this little canal, right? It's called an aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct. And then it is going to reach the fourth ventricle here. Okay, and so the fourth ventricle looks kind of flat, right? When you look at it from the side like this, but if you look at it from the front, it kind of fans out a little. Okay, so this is the fourth ventricle here. All right, and then this is it from the side. Okay, the fourth ventricle also contains choroid plexus, so you can make CSF there as well. All right. Okay. So let's kind of review, right, the flow of CSF through the brain. Okay, so CSF, if it started being made in the lateral ventricle, all right, here, it is going to travel from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle here. From the third ventricle, it travels down through this cerebral aqueduct. All right, cerebral aqueduct. All right, so the cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. All right, that's the next stop for our CSF. So it goes through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. And then from the fourth ventricle, it kind of has two options as to where it can go. Okay, so it can go this way, where it enters that arachnoid space, and it'll travel around the brain, all right, through that arachnoid space, and eventually up through those arachnoid villi into the superior sagittal sinus. Or it can travel downwards and go through and kind of around the spinal cord below. And eventually that CSF will be returned to those arachnoid villi to, go into the blood and get rid of any waste products or anything like that. Okay, good. So that's the flow of CSF, where it's made, all right, what its composition is. So let's just briefly talk about its function. So the function of CSF is to cushion the brain, all right? So it's kind of like a fluid cushion surrounding the brain. That way, if you move your head around, your head's not banging into your skull or anything like that. All right. It also contains nutrients from the blood that help to nourish the brain and the neurons. And it functions as a way to remove waste produced by the neurons and the glial cells of the brain. Okay. And it helps to maintain a stable environment of the brain. All right. So it needs, it's very, very, remember that blood-brain barrier we talked about, right? So it's very strictly regulated what's in that CSF and what's in the environment around the brain. Okay, good. All right, so let's talk some more kind of terminology relating to the brain, okay? So brain terminology, when we are looking at, and this will be more looking at kind of the cerebrum right now, all right, so when we're looking at the cerebrum, all right, so this is a coronal, right, or frontal section. So we're looking kind of front on at a section of the brain. All right, so we have our cerebrum, whoops, all right, all in here, cerebrum. All right, you can see this would be a lateral ventricle here. Maybe we're getting a little part of our third ventricle here. And so with our cerebrum, right, the outside is very wrinkly, like we said. Okay, and so we give those kind of parts of the wrinkles names. Okay, and so a gyrus is going to be the part of the wrinkle that kind of sticks out. Okay, so these are kind of like the bumps on the brain. All right, on the surface of the brain. And then in between them, we have the grooves. on the brain. All right, so between those bumps, okay? So we call the bumps, one would be a gyrus, right? Plural would be gyri. Okay, so one gyrus, many gyri. All right, and then the indentations, right? The grooves like this and this here, right? That is a sulcus or sulci. Okay, so gyrus are bumps, sulci are grooves. And then we can also divide the brain into gray matter and white matter. Okay, and so gray matter is going to be the areas of the brain that contain the neuron cell bodies, all right, or the soma of the neuron. Okay, so those are going to be found in gray matter primarily, right? That's what's found in gray matter. If we have gray matter on the surface of the brain and the surface of the cerebrum, all right, you can see that here, how it's kind of like a darker tan color, right? That's all gray matter, all right? And so there you have all of this gray matter, and it's all kind of wavy and convoluted to increase that surface area where you have those cell bodies. Those cell bodies are important for kind of processing information versus the axons, which just transmit information. Okay, so cell bodies, where they're located, this would be to process information. All right. Okay, so we can have areas on the surface for that, right? That would be on the cortex of the brain, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then you can have areas of gray matter that are deeper, all right? And so in this picture, they're kind of colored like this pinkish color and this purple color. Those are called nuclei. All right, remember, collections of cell bodies in the CNS are called nuclei. So those are going to be deeper. All right, and then we have white matter, which is primarily made of tracts. Okay, and so specifically, the majority of tracts here are going to be myelinated axons. All right, so these are going to be areas where information is being transmitted, right? So they're going to be regions where axons are running through to connect to other regions. Okay, so we can have 3 different types of tracts, right, in our white matter of the cerebrum. All right, so our first one is a commissural tract. All right, so a commissural tract is going to be connecting right and left hemisphere. Okay, so that would be here. These green ones would be commissural tracts, so connecting left and right. All right, and then we can have association tracts. These are going to connect different regions that are on the same side of the brain. So all of these would be pink in this picture. Okay, so we're connecting either regions on the left side of the brain to other regions that are still on the left side of the brain, or regions on the right side that are, to other regions on the right side. And then we have projection tracts, which go from the cortex, all right, so that outermost layer of gray matter, all right, from the cortex down to lower regions. So it can go from the cortex to some of these deeper nuclei, right? Or it can go from the cortex all the way down to the brainstem, or even below that to, parts of the spinal cord. Okay, so those are projection tracts. All right, so we're going to leave it here for this video, and then in the next video we'll pick up talking about the cerebrum and the different parts of the cerebrum and their functions.